You know that feeling when you witness something so pure and beautiful it takes your breath away? That is exactly what happened to every single person on the Jeff film set when Alain Delon and Mireille Darc shared a moment that changed everything. The summer of 1968 was drawing to a close in the south of France, where the coastal town of Nice provided the perfect backdrop for what would become one of French cinema's most talked about productions. The Jeff film set had taken over a stretch of the Mediterranean coastline, transforming the picturesque location into a bustling hub of creative energy. Director Jean Herman had assembled a crew of seasoned professionals, each bringing years of experience working with France's biggest stars. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to witness between their leading man and the woman who would soon steal his heart. Alain Delon arrived on set that morning with his usual commanding presence. At 33, he had already established himself as one of Europe's most magnetic actors, with a string of critically acclaimed performances that had made him an international sensation. His reputation preceded him. The crew expected professionalism, intensity, and that unmistakable charisma that had made him a household name across Europe and beyond. What they did not expect was vulnerability. Mireille Darc had been making waves in French cinema as both an actress and model. Her striking beauty was undeniable, but it was her intelligence and natural warmth that set her apart from other starlets of the era. She possessed a rare combination of sophistication and accessibility that made both audiences and colleagues feel instantly at ease in her presence. The morning began like any other on a major film production. Makeup artists bustled around their stations, transforming actors into characters. Costume designers made final adjustments to period-appropriate wardrobes. Camera operators tested their equipment, while lighting technicians positioned their gear with military precision. The familiar symphony of pre-production activity filled the air with anticipation. Script supervisor Marie-Louise had worked on dozens of films throughout her 20-year career. She had seen legendary actors at their most professional and their most temperamental. She had witnessed romances bloom and fade, egos clash and reconcile, and careers rise and fall. But as she reviewed the shooting schedule that morning, she had no idea she was about to witness something that would become legendary in French film circles. Cinematographer Claude Lecomte was adjusting his camera angles when he first noticed the chemistry between the two leads. There was something different about the way they moved around each other, a natural synchronicity that veteran filmmakers recognize but cannot manufacture. "You can teach actors technique," he later told colleagues, "but you cannot teach genuine connection." The scene they were preparing to film was relatively simple, a conversation between two characters exploring the possibility of love. On paper, it appeared straightforward, requiring nothing more than competent dialogue delivery and believable chemistry. But as any experienced filmmaker knows, the simplest scenes often prove the most challenging, demanding emotional honesty that separates true artists from mere performers. Alain and Mireille had been introduced only the previous week during pre-production meetings. Their initial interactions were cordial and professional, marked by the mutual respect that typically develops between accomplished actors preparing to work together. Neither gave any indication of the profound connection that was beginning to form beneath the surface of their professional collaboration. But something was happening that nobody yet recognized. Certainly not the crew members who were focused on technical preparations, and perhaps not even Alain and Mireille themselves. As the morning progressed, and they moved through rehearsals, subtle changes began occurring in their dynamic. The formal distance that had characterized their earlier interactions slowly gave way to something more natural, more intimate. They found themselves finishing each other's sentences during script discussions, sharing private jokes that made them laugh like old friends rather than new colleagues. Director Jean Herman noticed it first. With his trained eye for authentic performance, he recognized that whatever was developing between his leads was enhancing their characters in ways that no amount of direction could achieve. "Some things cannot be scripted," he quietly told his assistant director. "You just have to capture them when they happen." The supporting cast and crew began taking notice as well. Conversations grew quieter when Alain and Mireille were together, not out of discomfort but from a sense that something special was unfolding that deserved respect and space. There was an electricity in the air that even the most seasoned professionals could feel but struggled to define. But nobody yet knew that they were about to witness a moment that would define not just the film they were making, but the beginning of one of French cinema's most enduring love stories. As the clock approached 11 and the crew prepared for their first major scene of the day, the atmosphere on set shifted into that focused intensity that precedes significant creative moments. Cameras were positioned, lights adjusted, and sound equipment tested one final time. Alain and Mireille took their positions, but something in their eyes suggested this would be unlike any scene they had performed before. All took their positions, but something in their eyes suggested this would be unlike any scene they had performed before. The script called for a simple dialogue exchange between their characters: Jeff, a nightclub owner with a complicated past, and Sylvie, the woman who might represent his chance at redemption. The words themselves were not particularly poetic or dramatic, but in the hands of skilled actors, even mundane dialogue could become profound. Director Jan Herman called for quiet on the set. The usual chatter of crew members faded to whispers, then to complete silence. Somewhere in the distance, Mediterranean waves lapped gently against the nice coastline, providing a subtle rhythm that seemed to match the collective heartbeat of everyone present. "Action," Herman called softly, and the scene began. What started as professional performance quickly transformed into something far more authentic. As Alain delivered his lines, something shifted in his voice, a vulnerability that his previous roles had rarely revealed. The words seemed to emerge not from his character Jeff, but from somewhere deeper, more personal. Mireille responded with equal authenticity, her usual polished delivery replaced by something raw and immediate. The dialogue continued as scripted, but underneath the words a completely different conversation was taking place. One conducted through glances, subtle gestures, and the kind of nonverbal communication that occurs between two people discovering they understand each other in ways they had never expected. Cinematographer Claude Lecomte found himself holding his breath behind the camera. In his decades of experience, he had learned to distinguish between manufactured chemistry and genuine connection. What he was witnessing through his lens belonged firmly in the latter category. The turning point came during what should have been a routine moment in the scene. The script called for Jeff to place a reassuring hand on Sylvie's shoulder, a simple gesture designed to convey comfort and growing trust between the characters. But when Alain reached out to touch Mireille's shoulder, something extraordinary happened. The moment their hands made contact, both actors seemed to forget they were performing. Mireille's eyes filled with tears that were not scripted, and Alain's carefully controlled expression softened into something achingly tender. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other, and everyone watching realized they were witnessing the exact moment when two people fall in love. But the most shocking thing was what happened next. Script supervisor Marie-Louise later wrote in her production notes that she had never seen a film set react this way to a performance. The silence that followed was not the professional quiet that typically accompanies good acting. It was the hushed reverence that people experience when witnessing something sacred. Makeup artist Francoise, who had been standing ready with powder and lipstick for touch-ups, found tears streaming down her own face. She had worked with hundreds of actors over the years, applying cosmetics to faces that would soon pretend to experience every human emotion imaginable, but this was not pretense. This was two human beings discovering each other in real time, and the beauty of it was overwhelming. Sound engineer Philippe, whose job required him to remain focused on technical details throughout every take, found himself forgetting to monitor his equipment levels. Years later, he would tell colleagues that the quality of silence that followed their exchange was unlike anything he had ever captured on recording equipment. Even the hardened lighting crew, men who prided themselves on maintaining professional detachment during emotional scenes, stood transfixed. Jean-Claude, the head electrician who had lit some of the most romantic scenes in French cinema history, later admitted that he had never seen two people more perfectly illuminated by love itself. Director Herman realized they were no longer filming the scene he had planned. Instead, his cameras were capturing the birth of something real and unprecedented. His directorial instincts told him to call cut, but his human instincts recognized that interrupting this moment would be almost criminal. The scene continued, but it was no longer about Jeff and Sylvie. Alain and Mireille were speaking the scripted words, but they were saying them to each other, not to their characters. When the dialogue called for Jeff to confess his fear of opening his heart again, Alain's voice carried the weight of genuine vulnerability that had nothing to do with acting technique and everything to do with finding himself unexpectedly defenseless in the presence of this remarkable woman. When Sylvie's lines required her to respond with empathy and growing affection, Mireille delivered them with such natural warmth that several crew members later said they felt like voyeurs watching an intimate private Conversation rather than professional observers of a performed scene. The emotional crescendo came when the script called for their characters to share their first kiss. What should have been a carefully choreographed moment between actors became something entirely different. When their lips met, the gentleness and genuine emotion of the kiss was so palpable that it seemed to ripple through everyone present. At this exact moment, something happened that had never occurred in Jan Herman's 20-year directing career. Camera operator Michel, whose job required steady hands and unwavering focus, found his equipment shaking as tears blurred his vision. The man who had filmed countless romantic scenes without emotional reaction was crying like a child watching his first love story. Assistant director Laurent, whose responsibility was to maintain order and schedule adherence, completely forgot to track the scene's running time. His clipboard hung forgotten in his hands as he watched two people fall in love with a sincerity that made Hollywood's greatest romantic scenes seem artificial by comparison. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the film's producer. Georges Casati, a businessman known for his practical approach to filmmaking and his immunity to on-set romanticism. As he watched Alain and Mireille discover each other, he found himself remembering why he had fallen in love with cinema in the first place. When the scene finally ended and Herman quietly called "cut," nobody moved. The set remained in absolute silence for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Alain and Mireille stayed exactly where they were, still looking into each other's eyes, seemingly unaware that cameras had stopped rolling. What happened next would become the stuff of French film legend, but it also marked the beginning of their 15-year love story. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of Mediterranean waves, and the barely audible whir of camera equipment that had automatically continued running even though the scene had officially ended. Nobody seemed capable of movement, as if the entire production had been frozen in time by the sheer authenticity of what they had just witnessed. Director Jan Herman was the first to break the spell, but when he opened his mouth to speak, no words came out. In his 2 decades of filmmaking, he had directed dozens of romantic scenes, worked with some of France's most celebrated actors, and witnessed countless moments of on-screen chemistry. But this was different. This was not acting, this was life unfolding before his cameras, raw and unfiltered and more beautiful than anything any screenwriter could have imagined. Alain and Mireille remained motionless, still lost in each other's eyes. The professional masks they wore as established actors had completely dissolved, leaving only two human beings who had just discovered something extraordinary together. Neither seemed aware that they were surrounded by 30 crew members, all of whom had become involuntary witnesses to the birth of what would become one of French cinema's legendary romances. Makeup artist Francoise was the first to move, reaching into her kit for tissues, not for her actors, but for herself. Tears continued streaming down her face as she tried to process what she had just seen. In 30 years of doing makeup for love scenes, she whispered to costume designer Marie Pierre, "I have never seen anything so beautiful." That was not performance. That was pure emotion. Cinematographer Claude Lecomte slowly stepped back from his camera, his hands shaking slightly as he removed his eye from the viewfinder. The images he had just captured would later be described by film critics as some of the most genuine romantic footage ever recorded. But in that moment, he felt less like a professional cinematographer and more like someone who had accidentally photographed lightning in a bottle. Sound engineer Philippe discovered that his equipment had captured not just their dialogue, but something far more precious, the sound of two people falling in love. The subtle changes in their breathing, the gentle catch in Mireille's voice, the way Alain's carefully controlled diction had softened into something achingly vulnerable. These were the kinds of audio treasures that no amount of technical skill could manufacture. But you have not seen the most incredible part yet. Script supervisor Marie-Louise found herself unable to make her usual detailed notes about the scene's execution. Her pen hovered over her clipboard as she realized that what had just occurred could not be adequately described in professional terminology. How do you document the exact moment when two people discover they are meant for each other? How do you note in a production report that love has just been born? The supporting actors who had been waiting nearby for their own scenes found themselves completely forgotten. Veteran performer Claude Brasseur, who was scheduled to film the next sequence, made no move to claim his position on set. Even he, with his decades of experience, recognized that this was a moment that transcended normal production schedules and professional obligations. Assistant director Laurent, whose job required him to maintain strict adherence to timing and scheduling, discovered that he had no desire to move the production forward. The scene they had just witnessed deserved time to breathe, to be absorbed and appreciated by everyone who had been fortunate enough to witness it. Producer Georges Cassati, normally focused on budget constraints and shooting schedules, found himself thinking instead about the magical unpredictability of filmmaking. This was why he had fallen in love with cinema in the first place. For moments like these, when reality surpassed fiction and human truth emerged in ways that no script could anticipate. The emotional impact on the crew was so profound that several members later said the experience changed their understanding of what love could look like. Electrician Jean-Claude admitted years later that watching Alain and Mireille discover each other had made him reevaluate his own marriage, inspiring him to pursue his wife with renewed appreciation for genuine connection. Wait until you see what happened when they finally spoke to each other. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes. Mireille slowly reached up to touch Alain's face, a gesture so tender and natural that it prompted fresh tears from crew members who thought they had already witnessed the most beautiful moment possible. "I think," Alain said quietly, his voice barely audible to anyone beyond the immediate vicinity, "I have been waiting my whole life for this moment." His words were not from any script. They emerged from somewhere deep and authentic, spoken to the woman who had just become the most important person in his world. Mireille's response was equally spontaneous and genuine. "I know," she whispered, and those two simple words contained such certainty and joy that everyone present understood they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. That exchange would mark the official beginning of their 15-year relationship, but it also transformed the Jeff production into something unprecedented in French cinema history. That exchange would mark the official beginning of their 15-year relationship, but it also transformed the Jeff production into something unprecedented in French cinema history. When filming resumed the following day, everything had changed. The professional distance that typically existed between co-stars had evaporated completely, replaced by an intimacy that elevated every scene they shared to something approaching cinematic poetry. Director Jean Herman found himself rewriting portions of the script on the fly, recognizing that the genuine chemistry between Alain and Mireille was far more powerful than anything his original screenplay had envisioned. The crew, still emotionally affected by what they had witnessed the previous day, approached their work with renewed reverence. Camera operator Michel discovered that filming their scenes required a completely different approach. Instead of manufacturing romantic moments through technical precision, he found himself simply documenting the natural magic that occurred whenever Alain and Mireille shared the frame. Word of what had happened on the Jeff set began spreading through French film circles within days. Veteran actors, directors, and producers who had spent decades in the industry started making pilgrimages to Nice, hoping to witness for themselves the legendary chemistry that was already being discussed in Parisian cafes and film studios across Europe. Cinematographer Claude Lecomte later said that watching their relationship develop throughout the remaining weeks of production was like documenting a masterclass in genuine human connection. "Every day brought new discoveries," he recalled in a 1985 interview. "They were not just falling in love with each other. They were learning how to love in the most authentic way possible." The impact extended far beyond the immediate production. When Jeff was released the following year, critics immediately recognized that something extraordinary had been captured on film. The scenes between Alain and Mireille possessed a naturalism and emotional honesty that set new standards for romantic cinema. French New Wave directors began studying their performances, trying to understand how such authentic intimacy could be achieved in front of cameras and crew. But the real story was unfolding away from the cameras and critics. The 15 years that followed would become legendary in their own right. Alain and Mireille's relationship became the template for sophisticated European romance. Passionate, but never melodramatic, deeply committed but respectful of individual identity, publicly celebrated but privately protected. They appeared together in several more films, each collaboration building on the foundation established during that magical afternoon on the Jeff set. Their love story captivated not just French audiences but international observers who recognized in their relationship a kind of genuine partnership that seemed increasingly rare in the celebrity culture of the late 20th century. Unlike the manufactured romances that dominated Hollywood headlines, Alain and Mireille's connection possessed a substance and authenticity that made them beloved figures throughout Europe and beyond. Industry professionals who worked with them throughout their relationship consistently reported the same phenomenon. Their genuine affection for each other enhanced not just their individual performances, but the overall quality of every project they touched. Mireille's natural warmth softened some of Alain's more intense screen personas, while his passionate intensity brought out depths in her performances that other directors had never accessed. The most remarkable aspect of their story, however, was how that single moment of authentic connection on the Jeff set continued to influence their relationship for the entire 15 years they were together. Crew members who worked with them on later productions often remarked that they maintained the same genuine appreciation for each other that had been so evident during their first meeting. If you believe that true love can really change everything, you need to subscribe and discover more stories that will restore your faith in authentic human connection. Their influence extended beyond their own careers and into French cinema as a whole. The authenticity they brought to romantic scenes raised expectations for other actors and directors, creating a new standard for how love could be portrayed on screen. Film schools began using their performances as examples of what genuine chemistry looked like, and their approach to collaborative acting influenced a generation of European performers. When their romantic relationship eventually ended in 1983, it was handled with the same grace and mutual respect that had characterized their 15 years together. Unlike the bitter breakups that often characterize celebrity relationships, their separation was marked by continued professional collaboration and genuine friendship that lasted until Mireille's death in 2017. The legacy of that afternoon on the Jeff set in 1968 cannot be overstated. Film historians now recognize that moment as a turning point, not just in Alain and Mireille's personal lives, but in the evolution of romantic cinema itself. The footage captured that day established new possibilities for authentic emotional expression in film, proving that the most powerful romantic moments cannot be scripted or manufactured. They can only be recognized and documented when they occur naturally. The crew members who witnessed their first moment of connection often said it changed their understanding of what love could look like. Many reported that seeing such genuine affection develop between two people had influenced their own relationships, inspiring them to pursue deeper authenticity in their personal lives. The moment between Alain Delon and Mireille Darc on the Jeff set proved that sometimes the most beautiful love stories happen when we are not trying to create them. Did this incredible tale of authentic connection touch your heart? Subscribe now to discover more legendary love stories that prove true romance is still possible. If stories like this remind you to believe in love again, hit that like button.